my name is Karabo Mukwena. So let's talk about digital sovereignty. Today, I'm joined by Mark Hank, who will share his view on the subject. Thank you for joining us, Mark.
You're very welcome, and hello to our viewers.
Yes. So, Mark, your background spans so many aspects, of the digital ecosystem. And you have for like so many decades, more than 2 decades, been helping organizations transition lawfully, securely, and safely into this digital ecosystem. And now we have this topic of digital sovereignty. So many people are talking about it. And I just want to ask you, like, what is it and why has it become such a topic of discussion?
What it is interesting because there are different definitions. And unfortunately, I think that what has happened is that there's been a temptation to define sovereignty in the same way that we define sovereignty around national borders. And that's really misleading because that's not how our digital infrastructures work. It's also not necessarily how some of the laws relating to our digital assets work. So I think that one has to look at it slightly differently from that. And really, we've seen sort of this temptation as well in dealing with that is to look at residency. And that is, again, it can be useful, but it's not altogether helpful. I think that the important thing is, do you have sufficient control and can you protect the data and the infrastructure that you are using to process that data sufficiently to ensure that you are essentially in control of it and that the data that is yours can be used for the purposes that you wish it to be used for. I
Mm.
think that one of the reasons that this has become very important is that over the last while, we've seen two global developments, and literally this is within a very short passage of time, that we've seen these developments that impact what we're doing digitally enormously. The first is the rapid rise of AI. Rapid doesn't even describe it. It's almost exploded around AI, and people are talking about it, and we're seeing huge advantages that people that apply AI correctly are already gaining in the use of AI. And of course, that's going to impact on their infrastructure, what they need to be able to use AI ultimately, etc. Then we've got the issue of the geopolitics of the day. Now we know that we had this sort of honeymoon period for quite a while where everything sort of carried on quite nicely and everybody was happy with one another to a large extent.
Mm.
Okay. And what we've seen recently is we've seen over the last 4 years, the Ukraine war. We've seen over the last number of years, the Middle East conflict. We've seen Iran happening and, the way that the US has had to deal with this. We've seen the United States itself in a position of conflict at times, but certainly disruptive in their relationships with a lot of their former allies, and not just their allies, their trading partners as well, with their tariffs that have come into play and all sorts of things. And this has caused governments and organizations within countries to re-examine their dependence on whoever is supplying those digital assets. And it would be foolish to not recognize that to a large part that is the USA. So I think that those are
Mm.
issues which we need to look at carefully in determining how we address digital sovereignty.
I mean, Mark, if control is one of the aspects of digital sovereignty, like, wouldn't data residency be the answer? If it's in my borders, I have more control.
Um, I think that it is a useful control measure in some ways. And, one of the things that we are used to is having on-prem solutions where we think that they're quite sensitive. I think, though, that there is, and particularly with the rapid rise of AI, there is a dependency on the hyperscalers that is very, very difficult to actually replicate in organizations and isolate ourselves from them. The thing about it as well is that if we try and look at this just from a residency point of view, etc., I think that part of what happens is our competitiveness will be affected in the global market. And that is something no country can really afford these days. We need to be competitive, not just internally, but in the global market. The world is a village. It's been a digital village for some time. The other thing is that I think residency itself can be a risk. We've seen that in the Ukraine, where with the war occurring, data centers, physical things within their territory, etc., were attacked. They were at risk. And the approach, what the Ukraine has done is they've flipped their policy. So they don't seek residency for a lot of their data. They rather put it out there, and in a lot of cases, they don't really want to even know where it is, simply on the basis that if they don't know, their enemy, Russia, will not know where it is either. So I think that, again, I come back to the fact that it is not about residence and whether you keep it with. That's not the way that the world works these days. It's about effective control. And that's part of what we've got to be looking at from a sovereignty point of view.
Yeah, and I mean, even with all of that, it's like seems to me that there is no direct answer for this, And if I'm like a public organization or private organization, and I'm thinking, okay, like what should I do? What advice would you give to government and private organizations? And does the law actually give them like sufficient clarity on this?
My view, and I'm talking about South Africa now,
Mm.
because I think that's where I'm best qualified to talk about it. There are deficiencies in our law, and it is not perfect,
Mm.
but it does give more than adequate guidance on what we've got to do in the circumstances. We have a constitution which protects our fundamental human rights, and we've got to abide by that and look at that. We have POPIA, which specifically protects personal information, which is one of our fundamental rights, and puts a flesh on the idea of that particular human right. Importantly, what it also does is it requires that we have appropriate information security or cyber security, technical and organizational measures that protect the information. And that comes in a lot of forms. We also have a Cyber Crimes Act, and the problem with the Cyber Crimes Act is that while it is important and that we definitely need it, but from a practical policing and enforcement perspective, sometimes it's difficult. It's practically difficult to get to those cyber criminals because they don't conveniently sit within our borders. They attack us from wherever they wish. I think then the other aspect of it is that when we look at the responsibilities, so we've already established that we've got to have appropriate information security, but the Companies Act tells us that the responsibility lies with the directors and they have to act diligently. The whole concept of acting reasonably, the reasonable man test, is based on what knowledge do you have? And if you don't have that knowledge, shouldn't you actually find out about it before actually taking a particular risk? King 5, and that's one of the things South Africa can be very proud of the way that we've addressed corporate governance. We certainly have done this better than the vast majority of countries are doing in providing that information about how you should actually govern. So the King 5, the latest version of the King Code, is an excellent document. And part of that says, hey, when it comes to information, you better be sure that you know what you're doing and look at emerging threats, not just at the current threats, but at emerging threats, which is very important in today's world, because there's no way that our law or regulation can keep up with the very rapid rate, exploding rate of how our technology is being applied. Then I think when we look more specifically at the public sector, there are directives around the cloud. And remember, if we are using the cloud, and certainly many organizations are encouraged to do that because of the advantages that it gives, there are those restrictions that that you have to comply with within that directive. And when I say restrictions, really that directive gives guidance on what you've got to look at, and critical to that is risk management. What you've got to see insofar as the risks are concerned. We also have the joint standards which affect the financial sector and suppliers to the financial sector, financial institutions and suppliers to them. The financial sector is required in terms of those joint standards to ensure that adequate security and control is exercised by those suppliers to avoid the idea of the weakest link in the chain being where we are most vulnerable. So my advice, I think, is that we have to effectively look at risk management. We're in a novel time. Things are changing all the time. So we've got to have good risk management to look at those risks and make the decisions. Not making a decision is one of the biggest risks that you can have. Okay, so we've got to make those decisions. We've got to understand the risks. We must mitigate them. And one of the things that I think is important is that leaders do not have an excuse. There is more than sufficient guidance to place them in a position to deal with what we are faced with insofar as digital sovereignty is concerned and the emerging AI risks, etc., to be able to address those risks properly.
Mm. And you mentioned earlier, the cloud directive and how organizations and the public sector is really just encouraged to use the cloud. Are there any like sovereign cloud solutions? Why is that we are encouraged to use the cloud?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and fortunately, the news is good. But let's first deal with the benefits that the hyperscalers provide to us. And it doesn't matter whether that's AWS, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Google. This is what they can provide. First of all, they provide us to an unprecedented access to technology. Their security, they invest huge amounts in their security, very, very importantly. And they also provide computing capacity, which is a very, very important aspect of any major business. The ability to be able to scale up and down. So the ability, when you need the information or the infrastructure, when you need data, etc., to be able to do that at scale is an important strategic value to most organizations and governments. So replacing technologies that interact with those that we already have in our system is really impractical. They form the digital nervous system of government departments, of companies, and try stripping the nervous system out of a human being, and that human being will die. So it's not easy. And I think that's one of the things that we have to look at is the practicality and the risks that there are relating to that impracticality. As I said, the good news is this. The hyperscalers are very, very aware of the issues of digital sovereignty in both the private and the public clouds. They've tailored their offerings to ensure that we have better control over our information and the digital infrastructure that we need to process that information. And if we look at their contractual commitments, they are sound. And that's also part of what you would be looking at it from a risk management point of view. What are they guaranteeing us? And is that guarantee sound? Okay, so those are things that one would have to look at. But I think that there is a lot of sense in looking at the digital cloud and doing that risk assessment and just seeing what, these are moving rapidly. You better read what was published last week rather than what was published 2 weeks ago, because they move and change very rapidly. And I think improve very rapidly as well.
I mean, you spoke about, having hyperscalers and then having access to this technology and the security. And I think now in this digital ecosystem that we're in, cybersecurity is such an important issue and cyber threats are such an issue. So, what are your views on that? And maybe to add on to that question, I know encryption is king, but we have post-quantum computing, that might put that maybe a little bit a dispute. So maybe if you can also give us your views on that as well.
Yeah, well, I think you're quite right. Cyber security is critical. Just remember that the cyber organized crime is the third largest economy in the world. Okay, it's bigger than the USA. It is bigger than China. Sorry, it's not bigger than, I beg your pardon. Only China and the USA are bigger than cyber crime, organized crime. So what does that mean? It's like waging a war against a nation state, okay? They've got lots of money and lots of resource to be able to try and steal your money. And to me, that is a far more immediate threat than issues around possibly governments seeing information, etc. Now, if you look at that, the hyperscalers, there are very, very few companies or governments that can afford the type of money that they're investing in trying to ensure that their solutions are safe. And as we've already said, it moves very rapidly. So this is a moving target. All the time, that reinvestment has to be reinforced. And for instance, with AI, and the rise of AI, the cyber criminals, they are definitely using AI to a huge extent already. And to defend against that, companies will also have to use AI to provide an efficient defense. Now, one of the areas that is important is encryption. As you said, encryption is a critical element of our security. And I don't think that many companies actually understand fully the extent to which encryption is part of what they do. And that encryption might come in different forms. It's not just the encrypting of data, but it's issues of access management and how we might use encryption in that regard. Issues of our communication, how we encrypt information between parties when it is being communicated. So encryption is something that I think is going to take up a lot of time over the next while, particularly because quantum computing is a threat to encryption. It's going to become encryption algorithms that were very, very difficult to break. And almost they use the word infeasible with all the computing power that we have. Come quantum computers, and those are going to be broken fairly easily. And I think that is a very, very important consideration, because even with the hyperscalers, they are using encryption to providing that service to ensure that data is encrypted and all the rest of it. And again, I would suggest that they are better equipped both economically and from a resource perspective to be able to match that march or what might happen with quantum computing. So we have to plan for quantum resistant encryption. In fact, the US government just this week put out an executive order, one of our friend Donald Trump's executive orders, but this one is a very good one. It says that any entity dealing with sensitive information, essentially, they must address quantum computing and at least have those quantum resistant measures in place by 2030. It's not a long time away, 3.5 years. Okay. So I think that that's an indication of how important it is. There's also a very important aspect where people say, oh, well, we can wait. The problem is that you can't really wait in looking at your cybersecurity, because there is also the phenomenon of harvest now, decrypt later. So the intent would be that information is harvested now, and I've already had a client that believes that their information has been compromised. And they said, but it is all encrypted. But they recognized, and one of the reasons that they consulted with me, and well, they consulted somebody else, and they then addressed this with me, was that they recognized that if that data is decrypted in about 4 or 5 years' time, whenever this comes, it could be sooner, that would be a huge embarrassment to them. And what could they do? And the answer is, well, there's very little apart from trying to get that information and understanding who's actually taken that information. And what happened there is that they were a little slack because they had this encryption in place. They were a little slack on their access controls. And that's not how cybersecurity works. Cybersecurity works in layers that interact with one another to provide the security, the appropriate security that you need. So I think that it is important that this is an issue that companies and government start looking at very, very seriously and addressing as quickly as they can. It is already a clear and present danger to people that are processing sensitive information.
Mark, those are all the questions that I had for you today. This conversation with you has been so insightful. And really, my biggest takeaway here is really this is a risk management exercise. And there are solutions, there are ways to really have digital sovereignty, whether you're in the public sector or private sector, there are solutions for you. And so, with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. This conversation really did add a lot of thinking, a lot to my thinking about digital sovereignty. And I hope it's also added to the thinking of anyone who's listening. So thank you, Mark.
You're very welcome. And yes, go ahead and fight the good fight. Thank you, Cleopa.
Yes, thank you.